Lieutenant Paul Hendricks stands at the back of the briefing room while the other officers take their seats around the conference table. Nobody looks his way. Nobody saves him a spot. He's used to it by now. Colonel Martinez spreads maps across the table and begins outlining the training exercise. We need someone to coordinate logistics for the mock deployment next week. Food, supplies, transportation, all the behind-the-scenes work. The room goes quiet. None of the senior lieutenants volunteer. This kind of assignment won't get anyone noticed or promoted. Before continuing the story, let us know in the comments what city are you watching this story from. Hendricks, the colonel says without looking up from his maps. You'll handle it. Yes, sir, Paul replies from the back of the room. A few officers exchange glances. Of course they'd give it to Hendricks. He's the one they always give the thankless jobs to. Paul takes notes while the colonel explains the exercise details. 400 soldiers, 3 days in the field, complete simulation of combat operations. The kind of training that can make or break military careers, depending on how well it goes. When the meeting ends, the other officers file out talking among themselves about tactics and strategy. Paul stays behind to collect the leftover paperwork and clean up the conference room. For 18 months, Lieutenant Paul Hendricks has been the invisible officer. Fresh out of West Point with average grades and no family connections in the military. While other lieutenants get assigned to lead infantry platoons or work on high-profile projects, Paul gets the paperwork assignments nobody else wants. He coordinates supply deliveries, schedules vehicle maintenance, and files reports that disappear into administrative black holes. The other officers barely know his name. When they need someone to handle the boring details, they just point to that quiet guy in the corner. Paul doesn't complain. He shows up early, stays late, and does whatever job they give him with the same careful attention. While other lieutenants are out drinking and networking, Paul studies logistics manuals and memorizes supply regulations. His efficiency reports are solid but unremarkable. Adequate performance? His superior's right. Follows orders without complaint. The kind of evaluation that leads to a mediocre career managing paperwork until retirement. But Paul keeps working, keeps learning, keeps believing that competence matters more than connections. The mock deployment is scheduled to begin on Monday morning. By Thursday afternoon, Paul has coordinated the movement of 200 vehicles, arranged field kitchens for 1,200 meals, and organized the delivery of enough ammunition, medical supplies, and communication equipment to support a small war. He works 16-hour days, cross-checking inventory lists and confirming delivery schedules. While other officers prepare their troops for combat scenarios, Paul makes sure those troops will have everything they need to fight. Friday evening, Paul sits alone in his office going over the final checklists. Every detail accounted for, every possible problem anticipated. He's even arranged backup supplies and alternative transportation routes in case something goes wrong. The exercise begins before dawn on Monday. 400 soldiers move out to their positions, while Paul coordinates the massive logistical operation from a command tent set up in the field. For the first 6 hours, everything runs smoothly. Troops receive their supplies on schedule. Communication systems work perfectly. The exercise proceeds exactly as planned. Then the first crisis hits. A convoy carrying critical medical supplies breaks down 20 miles from base camp. The exercise scenario calls for treating wounded soldiers, but without those supplies, the entire training mission could collapse. The senior officers gather around the command table, arguing about solutions. Some want to call off the exercise, others suggest improvising with whatever supplies they have on hand. Paul stands quietly in the corner, listening. He's already solved this problem. "Sir," he says during a break in the arguing. Colonel Martinez looks annoyed at the interruption. "What is it, Hendricks?" "I have a backup medical convoy standing by 12 miles north of here. They can reach the exercise area in 40 minutes. The colonel stares at him. "Backup convoy?" "Yes, sir. I positioned reserve supplies at 3 locations around the training area in case of equipment failure or transportation problems." The room goes silent. Every officer is looking at Paul now. "You position backup supplies?" "Standard logistics protocol, sir. When supporting an operation this size, you always plan for equipment failure, weather delays, and transportation breakdowns." Colonel Martinez walks over to Paul's planning board, covered with maps, supply schedules, and contingency plans. It's the most detailed logistical breakdown the colonel has ever seen from a junior officer. How long have you been planning these contingencies? Since you assigned me the mission, sir, I identified 17 potential failure points and developed response plans for each one. The backup medical convoy arrives 38 minutes later. The exercise continues without missing a beat. 2 hours later, the next crisis hits. Communication equipment fails in the eastern sector, cutting off radio contact with 2 full companies of soldiers. Again, the senior officers gather to discuss solutions. Again, Paul has already solved the problem. I have mobile communication units staged at rally points Charlie and Delta, he says quietly. They can restore contact within 20 minutes. This time, nobody argues. They just nod and tell Paul to implement his plan. By the end of the first day, Paul has solved 6 different logistics crises that would have crippled the exercise. Equipment failures, supply shortages, transportation breakdowns, every problem the senior officers worried about, Paul had already anticipated and prepared for. The other lieutenants start paying attention. They watch Paul coordinate supply deliveries with the same precision most officers reserve for combat operations. They see him communicate with enlisted personnel, who obviously respect and trust his judgment. Captain Williams, one of the company commanders, approaches Paul during the evening briefing. Hendricks, how did you know to position backup generators at the command posts? The weather forecast showed possible thunderstorms, sir. Electronic equipment is vulnerable to power surges from lightning strikes. And the extra food supplies? Field exercises always run longer than planned, sir. Hungry soldiers don't perform well. Williams nods slowly. Where did you learn all this? Logistics manuals, sir, and paying attention to what goes wrong during previous exercises. Word spreads quickly through the officer corps. The quiet lieutenant who nobody noticed has been preventing disasters they didn't even know were coming. Major Thompson, the exercise commander, calls Paul to the command tent on the second evening. Lieutenant, I want to understand something. You've been solving problems before they happen. How? Paul points to his planning board, now covered with updates and modifications based on real-time conditions. Experience teaches us that certain things always go wrong, sir. Equipment fails, weather changes, people make mistakes. If you plan for the most likely problems, you can usually handle them without disrupting the mission. But you're a new officer. How do you have this experience? I don't have field experience, sir, but I've been studying after-action reports from exercises like this for the past year. The same problems show up repeatedly. I just made sure we were ready for them. Major Thompson studies the planning board. Every contingency Paul prepared for has happened exactly as predicted. Equipment failures, communication breakdowns, supply shortages, all handled seamlessly because one lieutenant took the time to think ahead. Why didn't you mention these contingency plans during the briefings? Paul considers the question. Nobody asked, sir, and the plans only work if they're already in place when problems occur. By the time we need backup supplies, it's too late to arrange them. The exercise ends on Wednesday afternoon with a success rate higher than any previous training mission. 400 soldiers completed complex combat scenarios without a single logistical failure disrupting their operations. During the final debriefing, Colonel Martinez addresses the assembled officers. This exercise succeeded because someone understood that battles are won by the soldiers who fight, but lost by the officers who failed to support them properly. He looks directly at Paul. Lieutenant Hendricks demonstrated something we often forget, that silent competence is more valuable than loud confidence. The room is quiet. Every officer understands what the colonel is saying. Effective immediately, Lieutenant Hendricks is promoted to operations officer for this battalion. He'll be responsible for planning and coordinating all future training exercises. Paul feels the weight of 40 pairs of eyes on him. For 18 months, he's been invisible. Now, suddenly, everyone sees him clearly. After the meeting, several officers approach Paul to introduce themselves properly. Captain Williams shakes his hand and says, "I should have paid attention to you earlier." "No need, sir," Paul replies. "I was just doing my job." That's exactly why we should have been paying attention. 6 months later, Paul sits in the same briefing room where he used to stand in the back corner. Now he's at the conference table, presenting logistics plans to officers who hang on every word. He speaks quietly, the same way he always has. But now when Lieutenant Paul Hendricks talks, people listen. Not because he demands attention, but because he's earned their respect one successful mission at a time. The lesson spreads through the battalion. Sometimes the most important person in the room is the one nobody notices. Sometimes the officer who saves the mission is the one who never says a word about it. Paul learned that silence isn't weakness, it's focus. And focus, applied consistently over time, gets noticed by the people who matter most.